So thank you so much for this invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Patricia, and I'm here to talk to you about this paper that I've co-authored with Sonia about this municipal program. So now we're going to come down from the national level to the local level and discuss this program that has been going on since 2017, led by Lisbon municipality. What I want to argue is that the need for institutional capacity to deliver housing. So public-private partnerships could not be used as a solution for lack of institutional capacity. So many municipalities around the globe are faced with budget constraints, as we know, no news there. And many are trying to find these bridges, bridging the public and the private sector to try and sort of cover that hole they have now left. Now, they can't do it without institutional capacity. Let me expand a bit on what I mean by institutional capacity. So this presentation is not either for or against public-private partnerships for housing. It's not a normative stance. It's like marriages. There's good ones and bad ones. That's where I stand, at least. Yeah, let's leave alone the issue of if PPPs are good or bad. Let's try and understand how they work, why different stakeholders want to mobilize PPPs, and where we are at with this program in Lisbon. Okay, so following from Nuno's presentation, there's no news here in the sense that Lisbon is in real pear shape when it comes to housing affordability. We're making to the top of many rankings globally. There's a real dire situation going on, and it's particularly an intergenerational issue because the lucky ones, some of us in the room that managed to buy property before really the 2012s, that decade, we are sort of okay, sort of struggling with interest rates rises, but we're on the property ladder, as the English like to call it. But the ones who didn't are now real in dire straits because of property prices, both to buy or to rent, particularly, as Nuno stressed, in city centers, the big cities of the country. So there's a real need in this continuum of housing. And here I'm drawing on Christine Whitehead and Monk, 2020, it's an old paper, where 2010 paper, but still, pretty relevant, that discusses the spectrum of housing in a more complex way than just public or just private or public subsidized or social housing. What we're going to focus here today is on this notion of affordable housing, affordable rental, which we know, it's highly contested, depends on how we measure it. What do we mean when we say affordable? In this particular case, the municipality chose to consider affordable based on the income of the families, 20% below the average income. So this time round, for this particular program, which, by the way, has a similar name to the other one, creates a bit of a confusion, but this one is called Programa Renda Acessível, PRA, PRA, as we refer to it. So this program considers, it has a complicated, sort of elaborated way of calculating affordable rent. But let's park that on a side for a second, and let's explore how this public-private partnership works. If you look at this Brata paper from 2020, what she does is, and I'm going to move here closer to the screen just to point out to the key so that you can then read the image. A white square or rectangle means discussions ongoing, and then if you have a bit of the square filled in is the projects are in procurement stage, and then you go through all the stages until the rectangle is fully filled, which means the PPPs are already working. So what you can see here is a number of different sectors: airports, housing, schools, health, and sports, and a number of different countries where PPPs are being used. So in terms of housing, you can see that in Portugal it's being considered at this stage, you're being considered, here we are, but in the UK they are fully working. With this note, I just want to emphasize that in the UK they are working, but mostly for urban regeneration projects. So not projects running from scratch, okay? And this program, PRA, is a program on municipal lands. Let me tell you more about that. We had a question in the back. Do you still want to ask?
Example, the private partner would develop the airport and would rent it back to whoever it is. So I don't know, is that the same thing? How do you understand the public-private partnership in housing? Like the investment is made by the private investor and it's then rented back to the state, or how does that work?
Would you mind waiting a second just to get to that slide? Is that okay? Yeah, no, it's a very important point, definitions, but let me tell you the story and then we'll get there in a second. So let me just explore a bit the rationales for entering PPPs. This is, what the literature is, PPPs are not new. Some call it, old wine in new bottles, how the expression goes. But what we have here is the public sector with lack of funding or limits to its borrowing capacity. You have this narrative of the private sector expertise, which might be very well true, but might also be a sort of contextual situation where the public sector lost that expertise, and this idea of value for money. On the side of the private sector, there's a real growing interest of investing in affordable housing or spectrums of affordable housing. There's no significant alternative investments for the private sector to a certain extent. There's this idea of portfolio diversification of risk. There's ideas around, well, there is demand, and there's emerging, in the last decade already, idea of engagement in social impact. It's the alphabet soup of doing well while doing good, corporate social responsibility, responsible investment, ESGs, you name it. And the particular risk-return profile, which we can expand because this was part of our exploration. So what we did to try and study this program was we looked at both the public sector and the private sector involved in this program. And the way the program works is the public sector provides municipal land, some land with buildings, most land with no buildings, and asks the private sector to build X number of units, from which about 80% will be affordable housing, affordable units, and 20% initially were to be free market, and they were to be transferred to the private sector for the sake of viability of the financial model behind this. Meanwhile, this changed, but let me hold to that idea and let me go back to that in a second. So the traditional conception we get from the 14 interviews we've done between 2021 and 22 was that this idea that the public sector is the holder and the protector of the public interest, the sole protector of this idea of the public interest, which we then found that it's more contested than you could imagine to start off with, and that they have mostly a long-term interest, which we're going to challenge as well. We also challenge this idea of the private sector solely interested in private benefits, even though we're not saying that they're not interested in private benefits. They are a private venture, therefore that's their mission. But there's this emergence of CRS, ESGs, which can or cannot be monetized. So let's discuss that in a second as well. And we also want to unpack this idea of the private sector as short-term interests. We know today cities are after long-term investors. So there's this sort of imagination that there's a type of investor out there which is the right one for cities, which is the institutional investor that has a really long-term interests and accepts this more beneficial for cities risk profile. Low yields is the lingo of the property industry. So low returns, but safe and stable, that match the liabilities of these investors, long-term investors that have liabilities such as paying pension funds, insurances, etc. So we challenge this idea that we can solve the city's problems through identifying institutional investors by saying this is an ecosystem. We actually need the short long-term developer that comes in, develops the buildings, and then leaves. So how do we attract this diversity of players, and how do we square this circle of providing the public good while we provide the private benefits? If you look into the literature in academia, it's actually quite frustrating, because in the sense that the negative reputation of the private sector is everywhere. So you don't seem to be able to work with private sector. You know, they are irremediably self-serving, aggressive management strategies, PPPs for affordable housing, damaging for the private sector. This is what you find, and you know, it might very well be true. Even though there's accounts of less irreconcilable perspectives, and some examples on the board highlight legacy landlords, so landlords that have a really long interest in the particular site, they care about their reputation, their family has been involved in this particular geography. So there might be more to it than pure profit seeking. Again, not excluding that profit seeking is part of their interests, except if we're talking about, you know, what's the name? Can't recall now, neither English or Portuguese. Not-for-profit is a good one. There was some other name, but it will come to my mind in a second. Charity, that sort of, yeah. Housing associations, yeah, those sort of players that we know that have other than purely profit-seeking motivations. I can't still, what's the name of when Italy and the artists were financed by? Mecenas, and but thank you, but there's another name that I'm after. But that's what I, you know. But you don't find many of those around, developers that are mecenas of. But there are a few, niche market. Anyway, place stewards. I did a bit of work on this. These are extremely long-term land owners in London, for instance, where they do have a interest in making the place better. They are there for the extreme long term. Some of them are there for longer than municipalities have been, which is interesting, kind of spins this idea of the municipalities being the responsible for the long term and the developers being there only for the short term. So we're trying to unsettle these ideas and explore a bit more the complexity of this ecosystem. So in a nutshell, GSOP really puts it down as in PPP's dilemma is that they need to cater for both the public interest and the private benefit. That's what they need to do if they are to work. Easier said than done. So now let me tell you a bit more about the program that we explored. So the way we defined it is this is a cross-subsidized model on municipal lands, quite important, so we need the land to start off this conversation. It was launched in 2017 by a left-wing coalition government. Coalition is important as well. Let me explain why in a second. Initially, there were 9 sites identified, which together would be able to provide 5,000 homes. There was a lot of debate about, is this a concession? Is this a public-private partnership? Well, it was a bit of a drama that delayed the whole process quite significantly. If you look abroad and if you try to understand, you can see easily that there's a lot of contestation around the term. Not even at the European level, people seem to agree on what is a public-private partnership, because it's a particular type of contract that involves risk sharing. But why is it not a concession? Well, it's beyond my payroll because it's really legal language. What I can tell you is that no one really knew, neither in Portugal, and it went through courts to try and decide. And in the end, it was decided that rather than a concession, it was a private partnership, which comes with a number of additional requirements in terms of finding comparators, why is this better than direct public provision, etc. So this program was advertised at major international real estate conferences, MIPIN and others, to try and identify and attract this institutional investor. So the investor with a really long-term interests that would be happy to put their money, tie their money to their project, and extract a 3% yield, annual yield, to match their liabilities. Well, what we found was really interesting. On the one hand, these institutional investors wanted to buy it all in one go. Like, oh, can we buy the 9 schemes all together? And the municipality is like, no, you can buy one at a time. And they were like, well, that's a bit small for us. So we're not going to get into the trouble of this literacy of understanding this contract, getting into the contract with you for 100 units or 500 units. Either we want the 5,000 or nothing. Really interesting finding. Problems of scale to match this investor. Second really interesting finding is to do with this tension between the concession and PPP and how important it is to get it right from the start, because there were disagreements both at the national level between the municipality and the Court of Auditors that stalled the process for more than a year. And then really interesting third finding is this idea of the public interest in how the coalition partners disagreed on what that meant in terms of the design of the program. Let me be a bit more specific. So the program initially was meant to transfer 20% of the property to the private sector. That was how the model worked. Now, one of the left-wing partners of the coalition drew a red line, ideological red line, saying we're not giving away public land. Fair enough, but by not giving public land, it meant that the contract, rather than being a PPP or concession, 30 years long concession, after which it would come back to the public sector, it would have to be extended to a 99-year period. Okay? What this meant from the investors we interviewed was like, actually, they were like, great, this is 90 years old, in our discount cash flows means the permanent, this is our assets entirely now. So really interesting tension between what is the private, what is the public good, how do we protect it? Do we protect it by drawing a red line and saying nothing goes to the private sector ever, but we extend the contracts to the point that no one at the municipality, because then we ask the municipality, who's going to be here after 99 years to make sure that the property comes back? They were like, well, we hope someone will. So really interesting tension here. And so, you know, conclusions, pragmatic conclusions. There's this idea of institutional capacity, which we need the municipalities to be able to act as principals, as in, okay, they've designed a particular model in a particular way. They need to make sure they talk to the stakeholders beforehand and that they don't want to be challenged at a later stage saying, well, it's not a concession, it's a PPP. And you can't transfer 20%, you need to not transfer anything and extend the link. So we need to talk. The municipalities, the private partners, and the other organizations, such as the courts, need to talk beforehand. Then there's, and align what they mean by public interests, for the reasons I've explained. And then there's also a point on what is the private benefit. But, and here, yeah, what we want to emphasize is this idea of the oversimplified views of the institutional investor. Because in the end, what happened was that they could only find smaller developers in the Portuguese landscape. And these developers didn't have the money required to start to initiate the construction on site. So they had to go to banks. When they got to the bank didn't know the model, and there was no land for them to give them as a, if everything goes pear-shaped, you take the land, because the land is municipal. And so the banks were quite uneasy with this process entirely. So where are we at the moment? There were a number of competitions opened, but there's only one scheme going on. We truly hope that the schemes go further, and complete, because obviously there's a lot of money, resources, municipal land, the hours behind, the staff working on this, the traveling to MIPIN, etc. There's a lot of resources put into this program. So I truly hope that it goes forward and works. But I think there are lessons that other places can learn from the problems we've seen here. So to complete, two points, one on the case and one a bit more broad. So despite significant resources allocated to the program, including municipal land and human resources, there is still a weak institutional framework pinning this case and other cases that link the private sector to affordable housing provision. And then finally, in a sort of a more theoretical point, we want to keep challenging this idea of this traditional divide between public and private, long-term, short-term, private interests, public benefit, because really we think it's not particularly useful. And if we are to spend time developing partnerships, we need to break these barriers and these traditional ways of thinking about things which actually do not correspond to the way the environments, the ecosystems work. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Patrícia.